Hi, my name is Dr. John Douillard and welcome to LifeSpa.com. And today I want to talk about hormesis. Hormesis means something that excites or stimulates the body, based on the old concept that what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. Homeopathy, for example, is based on hormesis. You take a very, very small amount of a toxic chemical and it elicits a very predictable therapeutic response. That's called homeopathy. Very, very important, very well studied, and very well backed. Now, my grandmother, when I was young, we'd go to dinner there on Sunday afternoons on a regular basis, and she would always make us a lasagna dinner and all of this. And she'd always have her wine. And she'd always tell me repeatedly that it was okay for her to have a little bit of wine. And she would remind me that a little bit of wine is good for you. And she would always remind me that as if she was somehow guilty about it. And she was never an alcoholic. She lived to be 90 and she did great. But what she was actually trying to teach me way back then was hormesis. You know, studies show that a little bit of wine actually reduces the risk of death from cancer, from stroke and heart disease. But too much of that will actually increase the risk of death from heart disease and cancers and neurological conditions. So it's a very real thing, this thing called hormesis. And it's an interesting understanding of how we can incorporate that into our life for longevity. And there's some really good, interesting studies about longevity. But first I want to talk about an interesting study with Amish kids. Amish kids turn out to have the lowest amount of asthma in America, or possibly even on the planet. And they come from a certain valley in Switzerland, and they came here to America and they did traditional farming. And the kids, they have pets, for cows as their pets, and they play in the barn barefoot, and they have the lowest rates of asthma in the world with all the barn dust. Their genetic kind of twin, called the Hutterites, came to America from the same valley, same genetics, and they became sterile farmers, modern farmers. Everything's clean and sterile. And the Hutterites, interestingly, have the highest rates of asthma in America, which is sort of interesting. And everything they do is super sterile. And they measured the dust that the kids in the barns, the Amish kids in the barn, breathe, and they found that the dust would actually cause a level of irritation in the respiratory tract that stimulated an immune response, a hormetic response. In other words, a little bit of that toxic, all that barn dust, which most of us would get asthma or allergies from if we live there all the time, created an immune response, which is kind of really important, and ended up giving them the lowest rates of asthma in the planet. So it's true. I mean, studies show, and I'll read you some of the studies that they found. A bacteria, for example, you expose them to a little bit of antibiotic and they become stronger and live longer. Worms live much longer if you give them environmental stressors like excess heat or hypoxia, lack of oxygen. Insects, you spray pesticides on these insects in very, very small dosages, they turn out that they live longer. Humans who have a stroke or have an ischemic condition, they actually become more resistant to further ischemic conditions, which is sort of really interesting. Studies show that a little bit of dioxin, that really dangerous cancer-causing chemical that's been banned for decades now, actually been shown to increase our response to other stressors when you're exposed to just a little bit of it. Radiation, which we know causes cancer at the tiniest little dose. Research shows that it can have therapeutic effects at a very, very small dose. Plaque, that we know causes Alzheimer's and heart disease. A little bit of plaque has been shown to provide, protection for the arteries and the brain and neural chemistry and cognitive function, right? So pretty amazing, right? UV light, which we know causes, DNA damage. At a very, very small amount, UV light actually does DNA repair. And it's also the whole idea of vaccinations, right? Vaccinations are a little bit of that toxin to stimulate an immune response. So we all know this whole thing. I'm also a big fan of Wim Hof, who's the Iceman, who uses breathing techniques, but particularly cold exposure. And his whole premise is that because we have clothes and we go from a heated car to a heated house to an air-conditioned house to an air-conditioned office, we stay in this little zone of 72 degrees or 22 degrees if you're in Europe, and And we never really get out of that, so we become conditioned to only be comfortable in that zone. And as you get older, you need 1, 2, 3, 4 blankets on you all the time when you're watching TV, whatever, even if the temperature is normal room temperature. We become intolerant to the cold. So his theory was that if he would immerse yourself with cold showers and even eventually ice baths and things like that, you could actually become tolerant to the cold. And the studies show that when you do that, you get all kinds of immune supportive benefits. So that's some of his research. Wim Hof, check him out. Wim Hof, he's the Iceman. He just wrote a new book that I think is really quite fascinating to read about all of his research and all the things he's done. He ran a marathon in the Arctic Circle with bare feet. He climbed Mount Everest with shorts on, broke the record to get big, 19,000 foot mountains. He's, broken the world's record for the longest ice baths and certain different things. So he's quite a phenomenon, but he's taught other people how to do these techniques, and they work, and the people that he's taught have actually been studied as well. So that's all about hormesis, right? But I think the biggest thing that we all experience is a dietary lack of hormesis. We find ourselves with food intolerances. Wheat makes us feel bad, so we don't eat wheat. We've been told that lectins and nightshades and goitrogens and oxalates and all these different hard to digest foods, anti-nutrients on grains and nuts and seeds and beans, all of them are too hard for us to digest, so we should therefore not eat them. And then what happens is we start going down the road of eating less and less diverse foods, which delivers less and less diverse bugs, which makes our gut less diverse, therefore more immune compromised and more immune vulnerable. And don't forget, we now know that the bugs in your gut are directly linked immune-wise, gut immunity, to the respiratory immunity we have in our lungs. So those two are bidirectional. Your gut, lung, gut pathways are very, very real. So if your digestion is a little bit off, your respiratory immunity will be a little bit off as well. So yeah, of course, you eat wheat, you feel bad, you eat dairy, you feel bad. Why would you continue to eat it? I wouldn't either. But you didn't solve the problem. The problem of why you didn't digest that wheat is still there. And studies show that people who eat wheat compared to people who are gluten-free, the people who ate wheat had 4 times less mercury, a heavy metal, in their blood than people who were gluten-free. The people who ate wheat had significantly more good, healthy microbes in their gut and less bad bugs in their gut than the people who were gluten-free. And other studies show that people who are eating wheat had significantly more killer T cells in their gut than people who are gluten-free. People who eat gluten, in big studies, over 100,000 people, both Harvard studies, one study showed people who eat wheat and gluten had significantly less risk for diabetes, and another study showed they had significantly less risk for heart disease compared to people who were gluten-free. And studies also show that wheat, whole wheat, not the processed Wonder Bread, but the whole wheat, the wheat itself, actually reduces the risk of diabetes and dementia as well. So, but the interesting hormetic piece to that is that these people who ate wheat had 4 times less mercury in their blood, significantly less bad bacteria, more good bacteria, and they also had way more killer T cells than people who were gluten-free. What does that tell you? The harder to digest foods, the wheat, the dairy, the nuts, the seeds, the grains, the lectins, the oxalates, the goitrogens, the nightshades, all these foods are irritants to the intestinal lining, and they trigger an immune response. And that immune response is called gut immunity, which is 70% of your entire immune response. So if you can't eat wheat, then how are you going to break down the 70 million tons of toxic chemicals dumped in the in our environment, our atmosphere, in the year 2019? Those are fat soluble chemicals. You got to digest them at some point. They're going to go to your liver. You got to break them down. And if you can't digest wheat or greasy fried food or dairy or nuts or seeds or lectins, and you go down this road of food intolerances, you become more fragile, more vulnerable, which is really why I wrote the book, Eat Wheat. Not because I want you to eat wheat, but I want you to have resiliency. I want you to be able to digest and detoxify because they're the same pathways. And start challenging yourself. If you start seeing yourself being cold all the time, start exposing yourself to more cold. Your body will respond. Just like all these studies, you give a bacteria a little bit of antibiotic, they live longer. Worms, you give them more heat or take away their air, they live longer. We know that if we do Ayurvedic kumbhak, which is breath retention, we know that provides and causes a state of intermittent hypoxia. Intermittent hypoxia means that your oxygen levels, your oxygen saturation drops down just a little bit, instead of the high 90s into the low 80s. Because when you hold your breath, CO2 levels begin to rise. And when that CO2 levels rise, that takes all the oxygen from your blood and just drives it into your tissues, your brain. And all of a sudden, you get this magical response. This response where a little bit of less oxygen, a little bit more CO2, a little bit more air hunger, a challenge in your body a little bit, all of a sudden, Nobel Prize winning stem cells are produced. Mutagenic stem cells decrease. EPO, Lance Armstrong got busted for, a hormone you produce yourself. Nitric oxide, Nobel Prize winning panacea molecule you make your own. Lowers blood sugar, lowers blood pressure. Transcription factors called the guardian of your genome are produced when you hold your breath and become comfortable with a little bit of air hunger. And historically, our ancestors did it automatically because we were moving around and we were breathing long and slow and deep through our nose, as opposed to sitting with our slouched in front of a computer and our diaphragm getting crunched. So then over time, when you stand up, it's still crunched and it can't contract fully and relax fully. So we don't take those long, slow breaths in anymore and those long, slow breaths out anymore. We start breathing really shallow, and that causes us to take in way more oxygen and breathe out way much more CO2 than we should. So we become intolerant to CO2 and over-breathing oxygen. And that's a hormetic response, negative response, because when you start becoming comfortable with more CO2, air hunger, you get all these magical benefits. Same with calorie restriction, eating a little bit less food, 30% less food than you need. It creates all types of benefit. A little bit of starvation, a little bit of hunger without starvation has these magical benefits, because that's our history. Humans didn't have 3 squares a day. Food was, every meal was a challenge. It was, it wasn't all in the refrigerator when you got home. You had to go figure it out every single day. And there were days where you didn't get it. So we would have to go with long trips with no food. And that created a hormetic response that made us stronger. And the harder to digest foods that we ate, the nuts, the nightshades, and the lectins, and the goitrogens, and all that, the gluten in the wheat, it made us stronger. And that's what I'm trying to tell you. And that's why I have an ebook called the Digestive Ebook. Read it, it's free. Takes you through a troubleshooting guide of how to reset your digestion. I've written so many free articles about that. Please don't let your digestion break down. Don't sweep these indigestion issues or food intolerances under the rug, because they will bite you in the second half, which is anything after 50. They'll come and they'll get you. And that's not good enough for us. We can do better by rebooting our digestive strength and creating a hormetic effect by opening up ourselves to these hard to digest foods and get our immune system back where it belongs. Please read this, I think, compelling article on Hormesis. It's at LifeSpa.com. It should be right at the top of the list, but just type in Hormesis and you'll get to that article and learn all about what we can do to actually strengthen ourselves by strengthening our digestion. And there's so many ways to engage in Hormesis. You can always look and see, what am I becoming uncomfortable with? And then you can evaluate that and see whether maybe that's something that you can actually train your body to respond to in a positive way, as opposed to a contractive way. Contraction, cold, retreating, withdrawing, that's what happens when you get older. And it doesn't have to happen. The centenarians on the planet, they don't retreat. They're still out there, in the fields as shepherds or whatever, in the cold. They're still doing their thing into their late 80s and even over 100. All right, guys, enough for that. Sorry to carry on. Such an important topic, though. I'm super passionate about it. Check us out at LifeSpa.com. Please read this article. And I'm Dr. John Douillard. Thank you. Do you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe and share.
This recording is brought to you by LifeSpa, where ancient Ayurvedic wisdom meets modern science. Get access to free health video newsletters by Dr. John at LifeSpa.com. These statements have not been evaluated by the FDA. These products are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.